Welcome to Scriptural Science, a presentation of Truth and Life Institute, Boston, Massachusetts, and Oba, Nigeria. The following is a subsection of the book. What is the Truth? Written and published by Ifeanyi Chukwujima, scriptural scientist and a servant of God. This subsection's ID is What is the Truth 8:1. Sex is a distasteful consequence of the original sin. Wisdom is the mother of mankind, Proverbs 8 verse 32, however, not in the same sense we humans think about having children. Mankind has allowed its understanding of the imperfect natural things to completely taint mankind's understanding of the perfect God and the spiritual things. Unbeknown to the world scientists and the so-called experts, everything we see in the world today is a part of the fourth age of the earth, and not the exact version that God created in the 6 days of creation. Many in the church, as well, may not have thought about this. That is because the teachers of faith had shunned the methodical approach of investigation which God gave to the church as science, and as such have failed to properly divide the truths of God. Majority of the people in the church has overlooked the purposes for which God did the things God did in the Bible. Most have instead tried to formulate explanations that fit their human understanding of things. We must all remember that God's ways are above our ways and that God's wisdom is above any human wisdom. We cannot make up excuses for God when God can provide for himself more than any of us can provide for ourselves, let alone provide for God. God knew that we would need extra worldly knowledge to gain better understanding of his mysteries at different ages in human existence. As the world advances in understanding, God allows humanity new windows into his knowledge to help mankind understand his truths more clearly. There is no magic in God's world. Everything about our great God is real just like we are real. The spiritual things are as real as natural things. And it is God's expressed desire to let us into his mysteries for our own benefits. But we must be ready to use whatever instruments and knowledge God makes available to us as intended by God, or we would remain stunted in our understanding of God. Every age of the earth is separate and different, and must be treated as such for good understanding of God's purpose and undertakings. God did not tell Moses and Aaron that infectious diseases were caused by microscopic living organisms, not because God did not want them to have that knowledge, but simply because their understanding of natural things at the time had not advanced enough for them to be able to handle such a revelation. It took a non-scientist, a fabric merchant who was simply conducting his trade, to bring the world into the mystery of germs. The microscope the man had routinely used for thread counts on the various fabrics he was dealing, he one day decided to use to look at the plaque from his teeth. And what he found changed the world's perspective on life and living. Single-handedly, this humble man used the microscope he personally ground to examine a number of different things and captured accurate records of his observations and ultimately brought the scientific world into his revelations. This was not an accident. It was an act of our benevolent God who gives to whoever he chooses to give, whatever he chooses to give, and whenever he chooses to give. When the people for whom a gift was intended graciously received the gift and put the gift to the use the gift was intended for, the result is phenomenal. This is not only true for science, but also true for spiritual things. The church has lacked, and continues to lack, cohesive methodical approach of investigation and monitoring of the spiritual clues God has spread across the Bible. Church leaders hastily jump on anything that has the semblance of the truth, without first thoroughly understanding the information they are disseminating to the believers. Everyone wants to be the first at every new revelation so that they can attract more believers and shore up their credibility. That way, they will receive better financial rewards and more popularity. That is not the spirit of good stewardship which Jesus Christ commanded of all believers. No one who honestly serves God needs to worry about earthly rewards for doing God's work well. God personally brings all his promises to fruition. No human being has any part in making God fulfill his promises to the faithful. Anyone who is obedient to God is sure to receive everything God had promised to his faithful servants. Therefore, the church must keep good track of the gifts the people had received from God and make correct references to those gifts for the gifts to continue to work for everybody. That has been a regular practice within the Roman Catholic Church. However, that church has had its own share of failings as well. Most other Christian denominations hardly give credit to any members for the revelations God had brought to the church through common members. That is why everybody in those denominations fights for the visible positions, as if the positions bring authenticity and relevance to a believer's witness to non-believers. Mankind's fascination with science as the beacon of truth, in addition to mankind's great desire for mankind to be the champion of its own courses in life, have together caused the world to look at God through the wrong lens. And believers of Jesus Christ and God have not done any better for lack of knowledge. God cannot be measured against natural things because natural things are inferior to God and to the spiritual things. Nature must be measured in reference to God and in reference to the spiritual things for anybody to gain true understanding of God and the spiritual things. God is perfection. Nature, on the other hand, was adversely affected by the original sin at the Garden of Eden and had since been reconstituted by God to become what we have today. We are currently in the fourth age of the earth. In the fourth age of the earth, mankind was reconstituted with a permanent sinful nature, and the biological food chain was kicked into gear. The goring of animals to death by other animals to satisfy a hunger was not a part of the perfect creation of God that resulted from the 6 days of creation in Genesis. What most of us have completely forgotten is that the original sin changed all of nature completely, and not just Adam and Eve, who went from having an immortal existence and a perfect life to having a mortal existence and becoming, from that point forward, susceptible to the storms of life and the formidable forces of nature. The original sin of Adam and Eve had automatic impact on all the natural creations of God. The genetic composition of every living organism was adversely affected by that one act of rebellion against God. That is why God promptly rebuked Adam. Cursed is the ground because of you, Genesis 3 verse 17. God's reference to the ground in this passage refers to the entire earth and all its contents. God rebuked Adam sternly for recklessly destroying everything God had created. Everything God had created immortal was automatically made biodegradable by the curse that invaded the world because of that one sin. Eve's plucking of fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil was an automatic trigger that activated and unleashed deadly evil particles on the entire world. And the activated evil immediately initiated rot and decay in all living things on the earth. Any world scientist that believes that what we have in the world today has always been that way is in great error. Human beings have no way of visualizing the way the world was in the beginning, except by trusting God and closely examining God's account of everything. Any other way is an exercise in futility. The Church's embrace of reasoning and the Church's concession of science to the secular world have constituted the biggest roadblock to the world's full understanding of the things of God. Knowledge is a gift from God, and all knowledge is science. If it is true, it is knowledge, and it invariably supports the truth of God and reinforces everything about God, be it science or philosophy. It is not one or the other. Both science and philosophy have one common reference, and that common reference is God. Everything starts with God and ends with God. Anything that has any other origination is simply fallacious and meaningless. The same way energy can convert from one form to another, knowledge converts from one form to another. And in all of its different forms, knowledge has only one flavor, the truth. The Church's concession of science to the secular world has allowed the world to doctor science into an anti-God entity. Anything that is anti-God has lost its substance, because the substance of existence is grace, who is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Science is God's knowledge. Science is no different in its truthfulness than theology. Anything that lacks God's truth is no science at all, but rather a figure of someone's imagination. Our world has changed a few times already, and science's method of extrapolations, assumptions, and consensus could not lead anyone to the correct understanding of the way our world was in the beginning, a perfect creation of the one God of the earth and the universe. The civil societies that triumphed over the established Church of God in the Middle Age, that had shaped themselves into the world's elite societies, have made knowledge all about whatever they say it is. Western civilization has spun itself onto the world and has continued to project itself as an alternative to the truth of God. Nothing is an alternative to the truth of God because God's truth has no alternatives. Anything that deviates from the truth of God is a lie. We can look at anything whichever way we choose. However, what we decide would not change the truth of God. Sex is an evil spirit and not the best thing going. And sex would always remain a destructive force in the human lives. Sex is perfectly suited for animals because animals have no soul or conscience like the humans have. Look at the following passages from the Bible and be convinced that sex was designed for animal reproduction because animals could not make their own determinations and so have to be compelled into reproduction by the spirit sex to reproduce. Otherwise, they would go on forever without ever reproducing and replacing themselves in the world. Here are the passages. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn? 2. Do you count the months till they bear? Do you know the time they give birth? 3. They crouch down and bring forth their young. Their labor pains are ended. For their young thrive and grow strong in the wilds. They leave and do not return. Job 39 verses 1 to 4. The wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, though they cannot compare with the wings and feathers of the stork. 14. She lays her eggs on the ground and lets them warm in the sand. 15. Unmindful that a foot may crush them, that some wild animal may trample them. 16. She treats her young harshly, as if they were not hers. She cares not that her labor was in vain. 17. For God did not endow her with wisdom or give her a share of good sense. 18. Yet when she spreads her feathers to run, she laughs at horse and rider. Job 39 verses 13 to 18. Verse 17 above tells us why animals are the way. They are for God did not endow them with wisdom or give them a share of good sense. Because God did not endow animals with wisdom or give them a share of good sense, animals must be compelled by the spirit sex to reproduce. That is not the case with human beings, who God created in God's own image and likeness, with a great endowment of wisdom and a great share of good sense. And because God had endowed the human beings with wisdom and a great share of good sense, God expected nothing but perfection from the human beings. God was sure to equip the human person with all a human person needs to be successful in life. The problem with the world's understanding of God's truths in the Bible started with the people of faith, who through generations continued to rehash the same wordings without looking beyond the surface to develop a better understanding of the truth God has given to them. God even lamented about this when he said that his people are perishing for lack of knowledge. All knowledge comes from God. Therefore, the church has no business pushing away any of God's knowledge. But the church pushed away science, and the secular world took hold of it and turned it against the church and God. God would not give his knowledge to the people that hate him, before God gives the knowledge to the people who obey him. But when you receive God's gift, and do not know what to do with what you were given, or worse still, ignore that which you have received, God has no choice but to pass the same gift over to someone else who could appreciate the gift and put it to good use. Such was the case with the knowledge base we now call science. When God made science available to the church, science developed inside the church instead of the church applying the knowledge of science for better management of the truths God had revealed to the church. The church decided to offload science to the secular world and continue with managing the Bible truths the same way it had managed God's truths for centuries. God had given science to the church so that the church could use scientific approach to methodically look at all of God's utterances, which God had posited for mankind in the Bible. The church, instead, dispatched science to the world and continued to spin words in the name of reasoning, thereby creating unlimited flavors of the same truths, leading to countless denominations. The church's refusal to grow in knowledge has cost the church so dearly. Each believer applies different quotations in the Bible as they see fit, when God had made available to his church the knowledge base that would have allowed the church to clearly divide the truths of God as intended by God. The church today would have been telling the world more accurately the things the world now misconstrues to pollute people's mind and discredit God. Part of God's great mysteries is the way God hid his truth in unlikely places throughout the Bible. God has hidden so much in plain sight on the pages of the Bible so that these truths could only be uncovered through faith in God. The Bible is not a book of literature, history, or any other human subject. The Bible is the book of truths and the only true source for all knowledge. But when you have faith in God but shun knowledge, your ignorance would severely limit your understanding of God's truth. This is the reason why many high-profile gospel preachers and teachers often mischaracterize the truth of God and bring ridicule to the Word of God. This hurts the believer's efforts in accomplishing the Great Commission by our Lord Jesus Christ. Christianity is not about frolicking in one's own salvation. Christianity is about becoming salt and light to the world. It is about our efforts and sacrifices to save others. Therefore, anything that could hamper those efforts has to be banished entirely. We all need to embrace knowledge because all knowledge comes from God. When you receive knowledge, you have received a great gift from God. And when you reject knowledge, you limit yourself severely and can make a caricature of the precious Word of God, which is life. On the other hand, when you lack faith in God, whatever knowledge you receive is for the benefit of those who trust in God. You have the knowledge, but your knowledge has no true benefit to your life because you lack the faith that will turn your knowledge into enlightenment. Enlightenment nourishes your soul. When you lack faith in God, you may have knowledge, but you can never become enlightened. You can throw your knowledge around and belittle other people with it, but your bravado would not turn your knowledge into enlightenment. You are still in the dark, whether you know it or not. When the church refuses to employ scientific approach in the examination of the truths of God that are written in the Bible, the church allows many errors into the church's doctrines and religious practices. And when the world scientists promote their knowledge, without grounding that knowledge in the scriptures, the scientists feed lies to the people and mislead them. Anybody that receives knowledge from God, the nature of the knowledge notwithstanding, is charged by God to pass the knowledge to others in useful and beneficial ways. That you were selected by God to receive the knowledge is a great honor. And any misuse or misrepresentation of the knowledge can be detrimental to your life. This applies to the church as well as to the scientists. God gives his gifts to human persons for general good. Therefore, whoever receives a gift from God is obligated to share generously with everyone else so that others could benefit from that gift also. While the church has stayed on this principle of sharing generously with others for centuries, the scientists and the secular world at large have operated under a more exotic principle: whoever finds it first keeps it all. This is the source of poverty the world over. That principle has turned human society into an animal kingdom where only the fittest survives. And the church has been quietly modeling its own policies along the same lines. In much the same way the original sin turned God's perfect creations into the imperfect world we inherited after the flood of Noah, mankind's wicked practices and mankind's hoarding of gods. Universal gifts continue to spiritually drive humanity lower to the point of spiritual extinction. This brings humanity closer to the level of mere animals. God is perfection, and the world that God first created was perfection. Adam and Eve were created perfectly and had no sinful nature. Their minds were subservient to their spirits, and that allowed them to obey God completely. When the satisfaction they derived from learning turned into an obsession, they sought to elevate their minds over their spirits and fell into the trap of the devil. Their reckless act unleashed activated evil upon the entire world, and the activated evil negatively impacted all natural genetics. The genetic mutations that started within human beings with the original sin permanently left the human beings with a sinful nature, making them susceptible to the desires of the mind. The rebellion continued. This is the true evolution of mankind, from sinless immortal beings to sinful biodegradable beings. And this is well documented in the Bible for all mankind to see. Anybody that assumes that the human sinful nature has always been a part of God's perfect creation is truly mixed up about the truths of God in the Bible. Perfection does not give rise to imperfection. It is that simple. Everything that is imperfect with the world is the fault of mankind. Unfortunately, mankind continues to move into more ignorance and continues to revel in our own filth. It was the rebellion of Adam and Eve that made sexual reproduction a default mode for human reproduction. Human beings had allowed sin to move them closer to the animals and further away from the all-knowing God of perfection who thought it necessary to keep sin and the knowledge of sin from mankind in the first place, because love dictates that God allow mankind complete freedom to choose. What we have chosen to become is no fault of God. That is why the Bible tells us that everything is permissible, but not all is constructive or beneficial. Love dictates freedom. But freedom requires discipline and discretion, or disaster will result. The Spirit of God provided discretion to Adam and Eve throughout. But when exercising a choice is your right, discretion can only advise, but will never decide for anyone. Adam and Eve refused to put the discretion that was available to them to use this one time. They, instead, followed the whims of their own excited minds and fell from grace. Most people in the world today are going the way of the mind just like Adam and Eve did. We all still have the same freedom to choose which was available to Adam and Eve. If we choose to ignore the Spirit of God and instead follow our own minds, we will each suffer the distasteful consequences of our decisions. No one sees clearly when they are looking through a dirty lens. Taking what we know about the human beings today and ascribing that to the human beings God created perfect on day 6 of creation is a great error that could only rise from callous spirits. Callus develops when biological surfaces rub against each other. Spiritual callus also form when the mind refuses the advice of the human spirit and is antagonistic to the spirit. And spiritual calluses deprive human persons of the great benefits that come from the Spirit of God. The following passage from the Bible becomes true when the spirit within a human person becomes calloused. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. Matthew 13, verse 14. Therefore, mankind must look at God through the perfect lens God had originally intended for our lives on the earth for mankind to be able to gain a true understanding of God and of all the spiritual things in the Bible that are described with analogies to natural things. And the only way to look through that perfect lens is through faith in God. Anyone who does not have faith in God has denied themselves of the ability to look through that perfect lens and the opportunity to see through the lens. For instance, the Bible used marriage to describe God's relationship to Israel and Jesus Christ's relationship to the church. But because we have so badly twisted marriage out of shape to now stand for a license to have sex and lots of sex with whoever we choose to have sex, opposite sex or same sex, associating the word marriage with God automatically evokes repulsive images. It is this repulsion that forces many preachers to spend very little time on that analogy. We have lost the ability to talk marriage without conjuring up carnal images distorted with innuendos. I simply want to remind everyone that human sexuality is a consequence of the original sin and was authorized by God in his rebuke of the Eve. Your desire will be for your husband, Genesis 3, verse 16. Right from the very beginning of human sexuality, it has always been a great liability for marriage because a host of other serious negative emotions are companions of sex. Jealousy, suspicion, anger, hatred are all close neighbors of sexual awareness and sexual desire. And these negative emotions tear the human person to pieces and transform an otherwise good person into a lethal weapon. A gift of God does not destroy a human soul like sex does. That is more reason for everybody to see sex for what it is, the greatest liability for humanity. Sex was never intended by God to be a part of our immortal souls, because sex is an overpowering evil spirit that robs mankind of holiness. We forced our way into sinfulness, and sin became a permanent part of the human DNA that from that point forward is passed along from generation to generation. It was the original sin that unleashed sexual desire and all the other craziness onto human lives and got every one of us bent out of shape. Originally, a woman being a wife had nothing to do with sex. That is why there were no mention of sex between Adam and Eve in the Bible until after their rebellion against God, at which point God commanded the wife to restrict her sexual desires to her husband. Your desire will be for your husband. Genesis 3 verse 16. Sex became the human mode of procreation by default because we had rebelled against God and had brought ourselves closer to the level of mere animals. Sex is an unholy spirit that sprung on mankind when Adam and Eve rebelled against God at the Garden of Eden. Sex was, and continues to be, an aberration to holiness. It was an obnoxious consequence of humanity's bad judgment and unbelief of God. It was the human disobedience of God that made sex a part of marriage. Otherwise, sex would have been clearly observable to humanity as evil the same way the killing of another human being is clearly observable to us as evil. For those scientists and evolutionists who have made careers out of convincing the world that mankind is simply top of the biological food chain, why does a human being suffer guilt from killing another human being? When animals never felt such guilt when they kill another, or worse still when they kill a person. How much longer is it going to be before we see a more evolved species than humans, according to your theory? If the human being is simply a higher evolved animal, the things that pertain to animals would also pertain to the human beings when it comes to intellect. Human society cannot be certain of a future in much the same way the animals are not certain of a future. And if mankind is subject to uncertain future, everything mankind has done and continues to do is simply an exercise in futility. And if that is the case, no human person has any right to tell another human person how to behave, because we do not have any reason to account to anybody else but ourselves. We have been justifying perverse human behaviors by pointing to the same behaviors in animals. If our theories that we are mere animals are correct, we must therefore turn every human person loose so everyone will behave as they see fit. We constantly contradict ourselves in our arguments about mankind being the master of its own destiny. Obedience is a choice that is weighted on eventual consequences. If all human beings truly believe the theory of evolution, no one anywhere in the world would put up with any other people's prescribed approach to life. Everybody in the world would do whatever they choose to do. And there will be absolute chaos all over the world. If the only thing to be afraid of in this life is another man's anger for not complying with their desires, it is easier then to get rid of those people than to continue to suffer under their control and subjugation for the rest of one's life. Thank God that there is more to fear than just a fellow human being's anger. God assures us in the Bible that we must not be afraid of the Goliaths of the world because they could only kill the body, but cannot touch the soul. Thank God for giving us something real to hope for, so that we can continue to remain obedient to authority. Thank God for freeing us from the snare of the devil that would have convinced us all to believe the lies of evolution, and so fight to death to grab our own share of the world's loot. Instead, God had convinced us to store up for ourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moths nor thieves could rob us of them. Matthew 6 verses 19 to 20. We are playing with danger by trying to convince all mankind that there is no God. Most people in the world hold back from letting everything go because they know they would have to account to God. If God decides to allow your dangerous insinuations to get across to all mankind, those who spearhead this evil effort would have nothing but regrets because they would not live past the first day of the world accepting their maddening theories. The fate the dictators of the world had suffered should serve as an example to the enemies of God. No human being has any real power to do anything. When people refuse to obey, tyranny suffers great loss. A leader's power is only equal to the strength of his people's obedience and their tolerance of his. Methods 1 Chronicle 29:22-24. And this is without exception. People of God restrain themselves out of reverence to God and not out of fear from tyranny or intimidation. Sex is a necessary inconvenience Adam and Eve would have given back if they had such an option. Marriage turns a man and his wife into one. That makes sex within marriage an internal affair. It is internal because sex between a husband and a wife is an act that takes place within one unified being, and it produces another human being. Therefore, God does not have to judge it when sex is limited to a marriage. Sex and sexual expressions any other way remains abominable. Flirtation is as potentially dangerous as sexual act itself because flirtation takes love and affection away from the rightful person. And when a spouse personally observes the flirtation of the other spouse, it fills their hearts with jealousy and disdain, a lethal concoction that often leads to hatred and vengeance. Like the prodigal son in the Bible, God's undying love and boundless mercy continues to accommodate every human person and make way for each of us to receive grace through faith and be saved. The human mind that got Adam and Eve off track in the first place continues to push mankind in the wrong direction today. Everything in nature, small or large, points to God and the spiritual things of God. But because human beings have been utterly polluted by sin, we always measure the spiritual things of God against our own natural realities, when we are supposed to measure nature against the spiritual things of God. Because of disobedience, humanity was made to breed in the same manner the animals of the world breed, because our disobedience made us unholy. This is the confounding factor that threw the evolutionists off and set them on the mission to destroy everything God. I have written extensively about this subject in my other books. Check them out and get full information on human sexuality and human procreation alternatives that would have allowed humans to continue to multiply in holiness if Adam and Eve had not rebelled against God. These are all demonstrated in the Bible.